Whew. Okay, so going live, I want to talk about some gardening mistakes I've made. I've made plenty over the past, it's been 3, 4 years I've been gardening. I made plenty of beginner mistakes as well as, been around the block a couple of times, but you still mess up. So everything from the tame, bad, and the ugly, gonna go over a couple of important things that I definitely want you guys to know going into gardening, whether it's your first grow or your third grow or your 12th grow, 30th, it does not matter. You guys will run into problems. It's just inevitable. All right. So when you go through life, you're going to have some factors, and those factors are always going to come up and fuck something up. So I'm going to take a sip of water real quick, and then I'm going to open my brand new notebook because I wrote down a couple of things. You know what? I think I'm just going to go into the first thing. So the first big mistake that I make, and I made a lot in like my third year of growing or my second year of growing, I did not lollipop or super crop my plants nearly enough. I always had little tiny nugs at the bottom of my plant that didn't quite develop properly, and it was a whole lot of wasted potential. I wouldn't take enough off, and I wouldn't bend my plants over to get the light to penetrate where it needed to. And I've lost so much potential there that when I think back on it, I could have had pounds more weed than I actually did. And dialing in your strategy for taking foliage off, taking off the leaves, then the shoots and the bud sites, all of that is super important. Super important skill to learn if you're going to be going for a maximum yield or seeing your plant's potential. Now, the only thing I could see differing from this is if you don't want to super crop and do some crazy low stress training like that because you want to see how the genetics are going and you just want it to grow naturally, then I could see just doing a lollipop and then not super cropping. But if you're trying to get the max out of a genetic, super cropping is almost essential. And tacking onto that, I'm going to be using a net. For the first time ever, I'm in a really small closet, approximately 5 foot by 2 feet. So it's not super deep or super wide, but I am going to be maximizing that space by growing those plants up and taking wall to wall on all sides, all bud sites. Low stress training, lollipopping, it's going to be my best friend in there. So that is something I'm going to have to really pay attention to on this run with those 7 plants in there. So none of them are going to get super big, but I do want to have a good variety going into my next stash that I'll be able to smoke. Does anyone have any gardening mistakes that they made lately that they want to talk about? Transplanting is another one of those things where you're really going to want to get yourself dialed in. When you're transplanting a plant, it can be really hard to tell when it's ready, but if you transplant too early, you can run into problems, and if you transplant too late, you can also run into problems there. So don't trick yourself into thinking, well, if I don't transplant, it's not that big of a deal because I can transplant next week, because it might cause some problems if you wait until next week. So going over too early, things that can happen when you transplant too early is you don't give that plant enough time to build up a root zone that is going to hold together all of the soil. And a big problem that you can run into is you'll see at the bottom of your solo cup, you'll see some roots start to stick out, but the plant's not actually that big. And if the plant isn't taking up a proper amount of water, which we'll talk about in a minute, it's going to be very hard to tell whether the roots are ready. And in a solo cup, it can be hard to tell anyway, because at that point, they're going to need to be watered pretty often. So it can be hard to tell with the timing, but it's going to be one of those things you kind of learn over time how big a plant will get before you transplant. But if you transplant out of a fabric pot, that's where you can really run into problems. Uh, if you're going from a solo cup into a fabric pot, you want to give it that time to be able to hold up that root ball, or else it will fall apart and possibly ruin your root zone. And a lot of the times it's not going to be fatal, but you are going to be running into a lot more transplant shock, a lot more stress because of the root pruning that you just did by mistake. So it might take a little bit more time to recover, start growing again, might show a couple signs of stress, but it's not normally something that's super to worry about. So it's fine as long as you don't kill the plant. I'm gonna take this sweatshirt off real quick. It's getting super hot. Whew. Give me a second. Whew. All right, I am back. So, hey, if you guys are getting value out of the stream, please leave a like. It really helps the channel out a lot and helps support me over here, do what I do. But getting into transplanting too late. Now, this is mainly going to pertain to fabric pots, but it also causes problems in clay pots or plastic pots. But what you're going to run into on the fabric pot side of things is that if you transplant too late, those roots are going to dig pretty deep into that fabric pot. And not only are they going to dig deep, there's going to be a lot of them that are actually connected and grabbing onto the fabric pot. So once you get to the point where you're watering on a daily basis or it's super dry on the second day, I would go ahead and try to transplant that plant, assuming it's not in flower. You don't want to transplant in flower. It's just gonna have to suck it up, or you're gonna have to take the L, and cause your plant some issues in the flower, sacrificing its quality, sacrificing time that you simply don't have at that point in most cases. But what? Oh man, where was I? Okay, so the roots grabbing onto the pot, that's going to be a huge issue for you because it's going to be very difficult to rip the fabric pot away from the soil at that point, or whatever grow medium you're using. But it's going to be very hard to rip the fabric pot away. And then not only that, since you're destroying so many more like root ends than you would if you had a better time, where the root ball is just engulfing the pot and it's not root ball is just engulfing the soil and not quite making it into the pot, so it holds on to the soil but not onto the pot. It can be very hard to dial in. You're going to be ripping roots no matter what, but you're going to want to minimize it as much as possible. So once you get to watering daily, definitely transplant as soon as possible. I've had plants in my outdoor grow actually where I had the pots directly onto the soil, and when I went to lift them up, like the pots at one point, the roots were actually digging into the ground underneath the pot just because it's been so long since it's was in that 1 gallon pot. It just, the roots went right through and burrowed themselves into the ground. So that's something you're really going to want to worry about when you're looking at transplanting. Now, a third topic I want to talk about is do not harvest your plants if they are infested with something that is not supposed to be there. And I want to talk about two things because both of these things happened to me. And if I could take away these times, I definitely would. If I could go back and change it, I definitely would. But do not harvest your plants if they are infested with bugs. And do not harvest your plants if they have powdery mildew or bud rot or anything like that. Do not harvest diseased flowering plants. Trust me, dude, you don't want to do it. So when I was growing my first grow, actually, if you go onto my channel and you look at the oldest videos, I'm pretty sure some of them aren't privated. Those are actually from my first grow ever. And I had these bugs called white scales, which before growing for the first time, never heard of them. Never heard of white scales. I didn't know what they looked like. I didn't know what to search once I saw them. But I ended up finding out what they were through some obscure YouTube video that I found that had like 100,000 views on it or something. But I found out what they were, and I could not get rid of them because the infestation was so thick. But for some reason in my dumbass head, I was like, "It's cool, man. I'm gonna wash the buds and it's gonna be all right." Nope, don't fucking do that shit. It makes me sick just thinking about it. I'm glad I didn't get much weed out of it anyway. I probably didn't kill that many brain cells, but I wish I would have just thrown those plants away. Just fucking out. Done. Try again next year, buddy. Not today. But those plants, they vegged out really well. I took clones from them. I think I had like 9 plants total, but they yielded like shit, and it was mostly shake, and the buds were small, and I just wasn't there yet. I did not have the equipment. I could not make the environment. None of it. We just grew plain out in a fucking shed, and like it was really hot, and then also really fucking cold because I live in fucking Michigan, and the temperature fluctuates. Like it can't make up his mind, but yeah, do not harvest diseased plants. You don't want mold. You don't want disease. You don't want any of that shit. Unhealthy plants, just chuck them. Done. Doesn't spider mites, any pest, done. Out. And if there are certain portions that like aren't infested with something for some reason, or like a plant made it out unscathed, obviously it's okay. But like if the plant itself is one that is having a problem, just get it out of there. You don't want it. All right, let's read from our handy dandy notebook, see if there's anything I missed. Lollipopping, transplanting. We went through everything in the list, but I do think I can come up with some off the top of my head, and one of them is over fertilizing in the flower stage. Now, going back to what I think 2 years ago, I was doing this thing where I was like, well, if I want to boost my yield and I want to get the biggest, most robust plants possible, I'm gonna need to boost the nutrients, right? I was at the point where I was like, I'm gonna experiment with pushing it. I was getting a little cocky. I was getting a little bit above myself, I guess, in a way. And I was like, well, I'm just gonna add like 2.5 milliliters of the nutrients that it says I need. And with the Remo nutrients, one thing I need to look out for, I guess not now so much, but one thing I do need to pay attention to is all of the nutrients, base nutrients, additives, all that stuff reads relatively the same in their feed chart, and they don't take into account that the plants need different levels of different things at the same time or at different times. So when I was in flower, I was in late flower about week 7 or 8. These plants should have been fading out, finishing up, getting to the point where they're showing that they're getting to the end of their lifespan. And since I was over fertilizing, these plants were just green. Just a healthy, stereotypical, run of the mill green cannabis plant where they should not have been that color. And I'm sure I messed something up with the nutrients and over fertilizing and giving them way more, because I was feeding Remo synthetic nutrients and they will just uptake that. It doesn't matter if they need it, doesn't matter if they don't need it. It's not like organics. They won't sift through what they need and select their own shit, and the microbes aren't doing them any favors. So they'll just take it all up, and I was running into these nutrient problems, and I didn't really understand what was going on. I thought it was normal at that point, but now I realize I was over fertilizing them like a motherfucker, and I was not doing them any favors. Whew. What are some other gardening mistakes? One time I did a dumb and I brought an outdoor plant into the indoor garden and then realized how fucking stupid that was, and then I brought it back outside, and that could have caused some kind of contamination, but luckily it didn't. That plant ended up dying of bud rot, and none of the other plants got bud rot, and it also didn't get powdery mildew, but the indoor plants had powdery mildew. So that ended up being relatively okay. All their own shit happened, but recently I tried to do my first run in the new house, doing a full indoor grow, and when I popped the seeds, I did not have any sort of climate control. I didn't have the clone dome in there or a humidifier. I didn't have a heater in there, and it was dead winter. It was December, no, not December, November, I think, when I started this run. It was in the same month. So these plants are doing fine, getting their nodes. You can look at those up on my X account at Cannabis Express 420 and check those out. They're doing super great. I'm gonna do a video really soon on them, but I didn't have any of the climate control, and it was super cold, super dry, not a great environment for popping seeds. But I tried to pop them anyway because I'm a stubborn, stupid asshole, and and one actually did end up popping, and it was one that I was really excited for. It was Blue Mystic, and now I have run out of seeds, and I have not got to grow Blue Mystic yet. But my dad did, and I didn't end up getting any, which kind of upsets me. But you know, whatever. That's neither here nor there. Not my problem, not his problem. So it did pop, and it started to grow, and then it just stopped growing for like 3 days, and I didn't realize it was dead until it started turning like gray, and I was like, well, shit. But I did try to start that plant in a 1 gallon pot, and who knows how that would have ended up, but it didn't end up ending up. So guess I don't need to worry about that so much. Oh man. How are your guys' gardens doing? What's everyone running? Oh man. Trying to think of more things. I've never had a problem with training too early. I usually wait pretty far along until they're in their like fifth node. So I haven't run into any serious training problems. And then there's always like snapping branches off of plants. I've lost huge, beautiful branches off of plants that I really didn't want to lose, but at the same time, it's like it's weed. It'll grow back. That's not that big of a deal. I'm trying to think of like things that'll really stress your plant out and like ruin your day, like doing pH issues, which I went through a phase where I check my pH every single time. Brand new water, checking pH, making sure everything is in the numbers, and I never had any actual pH issues that I can think of off the top of my head. And I've obviously had deficiencies and toxicities of the sort, and my flowering garden is currently stunted. Yeah, big fungus. My nursery is doing great. I'm glad your nursery is doing great. I don't know what damping fungus is. It just damp and fungus, or is it like a type of fungus? Because I've never heard of that or had to deal with it. But it sounds like your stuff has been pretty moist. Then, if it's growing fungi, I'm sorry to hear that. I've had pest issues, but that mainly comes from like underwatering. Underwatering is one I could talk about. I underwatered this lemon kush. It was fucking enormous. It was like 5 foot tall to 5.5 feet tall, and it was in a 5 gallon pot, which was very underdoing it. It was either a 5 or a 7, but that's not super important. What's important is I would have had to water this plant twice a day, or else it just would not be able to go. It was just sucking up water so fucking fast. So it's actually a two-part fuck up because I messed up because I didn't transplant it, and then I also messed up because I didn't have time like to be able to water it twice a day. I was not available. I was working full time, didn't have anyone to water it, so it just ended up being a complete disaster. And then that plant got powdery mildew super bad. It was super susceptible to it because it wasn't healthy, didn't have any of its resistance up, and the garden had it. Blah blah blah. It was during that super bad infestation era over like I think I did 4 cycles in it or something. It was ridiculous. You can look back at all of those videos. It was not a great time. Now that shit would not be acceptable. I would completely like if I couldn't get rid of it, I would completely cut my shit down and then clean everything, sterilize everything, start over because I'm not even gonna. I probably took like 7 years off my life just because of doing that. Because that was like I was growing a lot of stuff, and I always had a lot on hand. So the sheer amount of stuff that I used, it's probably done some damage. I don't advise it, but I did not harvest that plant obviously just because it had it so fucking bad. It was just unavoidable. It was like caked on it, so I was like, no, that's too fucking far. We just wrapped a trash can around it, cut it off at the base, and then got rid of it. That was not a good day. I've gotten male plants, but that's not really a mistake. That's just kind of happenstance. Properly stored soil. I should have baked it, but became complacent. So, man, improperly stored soil is a bitch. I don't know what you mean by bake it. Do you mean like bake it in an actual like oven? Because you're not supposed to actually do that, as far as I know. Because when people talk about like cooking the soil, it's just letting the amendments do their thing and like get through it and process everything. And I don't see how. I don't know. Maybe you grew fungi because it was stored improperly, and then you didn't like re-amend it or something. I'm confused. I'm not even gonna go down that road anymore. I'm way too intoxicated to be talking about shit I don't know anything about. So I hope that works out well for you. How were you storing that soil though? Was it in like a super moist environment or was it just like a contaminated environment? I never really had a problem with storing soil because I haven't started doing it until recently, so I don't really know how it's going to turn out. But before this past run, I was buying like brand new bales of soil every single time, pretty much, except for the outdoor. But the soil wasn't really stored, it was just outside. And we just used the outside soil because whenever we transplanted or whenever we harvested a plant, rather, we would take the soil and we would just throw it in between our 2 sheds. We had a veg shed, and then we had our garage, our big pole barn, which had the flower room in it back in those days. So basically, the cycle would go veg, flip over to flower. We had to carry our plants all the way over to the flower room, and then flower them out, harvest them, and then take the soil and throw it in this giant pile in between the sheds. And then that soil was used for our outdoor grow. So it was kind of re-amended and also organic because it was just with the outdoor stuff. So it would become part of the environment as this big mound, this big hill, if you will, of just organic soil with peat moss in it and with the the white stuff. Can't remember what it's called right now. I rock? No, it's not Rockwell. That's fucking the germination cubes. Some you guys know what I'm talking about. I can't remember the word for it right now. But I do know it's made from bed obsidian. I don't know. Maybe I just don't know. I don't know how to grow weed. What's a weed? Whew. I never really struggled with overwatering, but that's a big mistake people make a lot. Is they'll overwater their plants, and how you can tell the difference between underwatered and overwatered. And I'm just gonna go over this real quick, and then I have to let my dog in, and I think that's when I'm gonna call it quits. But when you're looking at overwatered versus underwatered, an overwatered plant will have its leaves curl in similar to an underwatered plant, but the tips will be curling too. They'll droop, and then the tips will like curl in, and it looks kind of weird. It looks kind of like they're blistering more than having trouble, because when you underwater a plant, not only will your soil be dry, your plants will droop and they'll be like super limp. They won't be like bending anywhere. They'll just be facing down. And they'll also become like super frail because they don't have like the energy or the water or the food inside of them to give them that robustness of life, and hold their leaves up without struggling. But thank you guys very much. My voice is getting a little bit fatigued, and I'm getting pretty tired. So I will see you guys next time. Thank you guys for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with the plant mistakes. I know I made many, and I think they're important to talk about, because if you don't talk about your mistakes, it is hard to help people avoid them if they haven't made them already. So thank you guys very much. I will see you next time.